Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled you're here today because, well, we're going to unpack something that genuinely affects almost every single one of us at some point in our lives. But behind the scenes, it operates in this highly complex economic ecosystem. Today, we're diving into a focused economic analysis of the real forces shaping the global pharmaceutical market. We're going to pull back the curtain on the industry standard frameworks used by investors and analysts and figure out exactly what drives drug prices and demand. So, why do drugs cost what they do? Sounds like a pretty simple question, right? But I promise you the answer is anything but simple. In fact, this question sits right at the heart of the core tension we're looking at today. Because on one side, you've got this incredible, very real public need for life-saving innovations. But on the other side, you've got intense market scrutiny, massive financial risk, and a wildly complex regulatory environment. It's basically a constant economic tug-of-war. And today, we're going to look at the exact metrics and drivers that define who is actually winning that war.
All right, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the pharma tug-of-war, then look at what drives consumer demand, explore the downward pressure on prices, track affordability and pricing, and wrap it all up with the final diagnosis. Let's just dive right in.
Okay, part one, the pharma tug-of-war. Before we can really analyze the financial forces pushing and pulling on this market, we kind of need to establish a baseline. We need an objective definition of the industry we're actually looking at today. So, according to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB for short, the biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industry is, fundamentally, an industry that develops, manufactures, and markets a range of brand name and generic medications. Simple enough, right? But the source material notes something absolutely critical here. Research and development is what really propels a huge portion of this industry, and with that R&D comes a staggering amount of financial risk. To put that risk into perspective, often over 90% of drugs fail in clinical trials. That's on top of the incredibly steep hurdle of actually getting regulatory approval. So the big takeaway here is that this is an industry built on massive upfront investments with literally zero guarantee of a final product. Just keep that risk in mind as we look at the financial forces acting upon it. Moving right along to part two, what drives consumer demand? So if the industry is taking all this risk to create products, what exactly is the pull in our tug-of-war analogy? What are the massive macroeconomic factors pulling drug demand upward? Well, the SASB industry standard explicitly outlines four primary drivers of consumer demand here. First, demographics. Second, insurance coverage rates. Third, disease profiles. And fourth, broader economic conditions. And look, these aren't just abstract ideas on a spreadsheet. These are the tangible, real-world realities that dictate the absolute baseline need for medications on a global scale. If any one of these four levers moves even a little bit, the entire demand curve for pharmaceutical products shifts right along with it. Let's isolate just one of these drivers to really ground this concept. Let's look at demographics. As global demographics shift, like, for example, as populations age, it radically shifts the baseline need for healthcare products. You aren't just looking at some static, unchanging market. You are looking at a living, breathing consumer base where the sheer volume of patients requiring treatment is just continuously evolving. The shifting demographic landscape acts as this massive, relentless upward pull on consumer demand. Which brings us to part three, downward pressure on prices. But okay, here is the plot twist. If demand is so incredibly high and demographics are continually pushing that demand upward, why on earth is there such intense pressure to lower prices? Well, the source text points to two main downward pressures that basically act as the counterweight in our tug-of-war. First up, market consolidation, and second, concerns regarding sector pricing practices. These two elements create some intense market scrutiny. Essentially, the market itself is acting like a regulator here. When companies consolidate, or when pricing practices suddenly become the focus of public and regulatory attention, it pushes back forcefully against that rising demand. Think about large insurance networks for a second. They act as a formidable wall against limitless price hikes. The industry can't simply raise prices unchecked just to match demand. They face this massive wall of downward pricing pressure from stakeholders who are heavily focused on keeping healthcare costs contained. All right, let's look at part four, tracking affordability and pricing. Now, what's really fascinating about this next part is how industry watchdogs, regulatory bodies, and investors actually measure this exact tension. Because they don't just guess, right? They use highly specific accounting standards to track it. To anchor these abstract economics, the SASB framework uses a couple of very specific metrics to track affordability. The first one looks at the entire product portfolio. It measures the percentage change in the weighted average list price versus the net price across all products. The second metric, it zooms all the way in on the single product with the largest price increase, again, comparing the change in list price versus net price. So this means analysts are watching both the broad strokes of a company's entire catalog and those extreme outliers where prices are jumping the most. And this brilliantly illustrates an absolutely crucial distinction in the pharmaceutical market, the difference between list price and net price. You can kind of think of the list price, which is calculated as the wholesale acquisition cost or WAC, like the sticker price on a car at a dealership. But the net price, that is the true financial reality. That's what actually gets paid after all the hidden backroom deals, the rebates, the discounts, and the returns. By requiring companies to report the percentage change in both of these figures, these industry standards strip away the illusion of a single price tag and reveal the actual, realized revenue dynamics of drug pricing. This rigorous tracking for affordability and pricing matters immensely. Why? Because entities that have historically relied on just raising drug prices or leveraging contractual advantages are increasingly getting challenged. The source material makes it really clear. Companies that effectively manage their global pricing practices and all the stakeholder scrutiny that comes with it can actually limit their risk exposure to regulatory action or adverse reputational effects. Measuring this exact gap between list and net price, that's how they prove they're managing that risk. And finally, part 5, the final diagnosis. So we've looked at the massive risks of R&D, the demographics pulling demand upward, and the intense scrutiny pushing prices downward. Let's bring this whole tug-of-war narrative to a close. The SASB standard actually captures this market reality perfectly. Quote, stakeholder emphasis on healthcare cost containment and increased access may continue to place downward pricing pressures on the biotechnology and pharmaceuticals industry, end quote. It is an ongoing, incredibly delicate balancing act. The push for cost containment is fighting directly against the pull for greater access, not to mention the massive underlying costs of developing these life-saving medications in the first place. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to take away from our explainer today. We know the forces at play here, but as global demographics inevitably shift and the baseline need for healthcare changes right along with it, which force will ultimately dictate the future of drug pricing? Will the upward pull of consumer demand win out, or will the downward pressure of cost containment reign supreme? It's a completely fascinating economic tension, and one that is absolutely going to shape the future of global healthcare. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this today.